So I cut it because I want to address that because just hours before that, he was pushing and saying that the country was in trouble and we needed more stimulus. And within just like a couple of hours, he just pulls out. I mean, what does that say about him as the president, and what does that say about his policy making? Because it seems as that he does things on a whim.
Well, let me give you an example of what I think is Trump at his most dangerous. On the 3rd of January, you had General Soleimani, the Islamic Republic general of Iran, assassinated in Iraq. Now, President Trump publicly admitted that he was behind that he commissioned that. This was clearly a crime. I've said this repeatedly, in the Tasnim news agency and press television of Iran is an anti-war conservative. I'm on the political right in this country historically. I'm talking about the Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul right. And I found the president's actions in this situation not simply to be criminal, but the president in this circumstance was relying upon some really terrible neoconservative advisors that he had surrounded himself with, who appear to be a continuation of everything that has gone wrong with American foreign policy, especially since 2001. But to actually order the assassination of a foreign general, a foreign leader that we are not in a formal state of war with, is a literal crime. And for the president of the United States to admit that he had done this, and for his political base largely to have supported such an action is simply beyond the pale for me. And I emphasized to the Tasnim news agency at the time that I believed it was criminal. It was not simply criminal in terms of the premeditated assassination of a foreign leader that we are not technically at war with, the Israeli lobby notwithstanding, but the fact that Trump commissioned this assassination to take place in a third country, Iraq, that was not on board with this and had not been consulted in any way, shape, or form, made it an international crime against two different countries. And it was not only a rash and absolutely immoral and illegal thing that Trump did in that situation, but he seems to have, and his advisors seem to have, no consequences of the blowback that is going to occur as a result of having done something like this. I lived in Iran years ago, as we may have talked about at the beginning of the hour. My father was a senior advisor over there years ago during the last years of the Pahlavi regime. I have a lot of Iranian friends across the political spectrum, and almost to a person, they understand that regardless of their differences with one another, that this was a heinous criminal act. It was a violation of international law. It was a violation of Iranian autonomy and sovereignty in a way that is probably the worst thing that the United States has done since the 1953 coup d'etat in that country, which overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, that is now popularly known as Operation Ajax. It became the CIA's primer for all of these illegal regime changes that the United States has attempted and in some cases has been successful in pulling off in all the years since. So that was the 3rd of January when, just out of thin air, Mr. Trump, having already unilaterally pulled this country out of this JCPOA P5+1 treaty with Iran. And by the way, along with Pat Buchanan and David Stockman on the right, and Philip Giraldi, the ex-CIA station chief, who's now the head of something called the Council for the National Interest. These fellows are all more prominent than I, certainly. But the point is, we all supported the treaty. We felt it was in Iran's interest and the ultimate interest of the United States to come to terms with this treaty. Trump, listening to these radical neoconservative kooks like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, just to name two, unilaterally pulls the United States out of this deal. And I've gone on record as a man of the right in saying that I think this was Barack Obama chief achievement during President Obama's time in office that we were able to finalize this deal and to go into it. Trump unilaterally pulls us out of it, not simply breaking his word to Iran, but breaking his word to the other signatories to the treaty and ignoring the best intelligence that 16 American intelligence agencies had submitted up to that point that indicated that beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Iranians were upholding their end of the deal in the treaty. So what does Trump do? He unilaterally pulls us out of that treaty because Pompeo and Bolton and Bibi Netanyahu of Israel, operating in a completely different wavelength from the rest of us, wanted him to pull out of the treaty. And then Trump proceeds to engage in all kinds of economic sanctions against Iran that Congressman Ron Paul had publicly and correctly said were acts of war. And then on top of all of this, Iran is not simply made to be the bad guy for having upheld its end of the deal, but Trump, having broken the word of the United States to Iran and to these other nations that were a part of the deal, ignoring his own intelligence community, then proceeds not only to engage in economic sanctions against Iran and to engage in military deployments that look increasingly threatening around the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. But then on the 3rd of January, he commissions this premeditated extrajudicial execution of a foreign general of a country that we are not formally at war with, which is a criminal act under international law. Now, that to me is about as reckless as it gets, and I have maintained consistently and continue to maintain publicly, and have said so with the Tasnim news agency and also press television, as well as with Sputnik International of Russia that's talked to me from time to time, that this is not only criminal activity, but it gets into the very thing that I think you're suggesting, Rashid, and that is that this guy is not necessarily playing with a complete deck of cards to be doing things like this, reckless advisors or not. Most of us, I think, hopefully have enough moral and ethical and political sense to grasp the fact that the president of the United States should not be doing things like that. And to the extent that he not only did it, but was proud of it and admitted that he had commissioned it, he has set up a situation, and I'm well aware of this because of the number of Iranians that I know in their state media and from watching the reactions of a lot of people in the Middle East on Twitter and so forth. The Iranians are not going to forget this any more than we would forget it if their government commissioned the assassination of an American general. We would not tolerate that. We would see that as a casus belli to go to war. In this particular situation, however, the Iranians are just expected to take this and to shut up. So in this particular circumstance, to me, once again, and I said so publicly at the time, I felt that the Democrats' case for attempting to impeach Trump on the charges that they drummed up were largely absurd and would not wash in terms of a conviction. However, if the Democrats had chosen to draw up articles of impeachment against Donald Trump for this Soleimani assassination, I've gone on record publicly in international television shows from time to time that as one, if I were theoretically sitting in the United States Senate as a Republican senator looking at those charges and knowing that those charges are in fact true, I would have voted to convict him.